interactive. We encourage you to ask questions. We encourage you to use the chat, participate in surveys, and just so you know, we will send a copy of this presentation out afterwards, both the recording as well as the slides that we're going to be reviewing today. So my name is Molly Yanis. I'm the founder of Echo Consulting. We are a project management solutions company, and we specifically focus on a combination of project management office, stand-up, as well as business automation and business improvement, and again, project management staff aug for key digital and business transformation projects. So enough about me, more about you. We're going to start off with a very quick survey. We're going to be asking you about what the biggest challenge you face in managing your projects is. We're going to give everyone just 1 minute and we will share the results of that before we dive right into what the biggest challenge you face today in managing your portfolio of projects. Melissa, I'm going to go ahead and have you share the results as they come in, and we will go from there. And anyone that I didn't mention it to already, we will be recording this session and sending out the recorded version for any of the participants that were not able to attend in person. Melissa, let me know if you start getting results and are ready to share your screen. Or if we have a quiet bunch today, we can go ahead and just give you what the PMI report from 2021 says. So I'm going to actually get going, and Melissa, when you start seeing results, you can let me know, but I don't want to spend too much time on that right now. So let's see here. Oopsies. Here we go. So what is the biggest challenge you face today with managing your portfolio of projects? Okay. The number one is resource management capacity. I can imagine that we've all heard it in the news about what's going on with the Great Resignation and all those other components. Resource manage it. Do you have the right resources, the right skills in-house, and they are available for the right projects at the right time? But today, what we're actually going to be focusing on is project prioritization, which represents the second biggest problem according to the PMO Outlook Report, the 2021 edition. Other major problems are visibility and reporting, the transparency. Does the right information from your project get to the right people in the organization so that you can be proactive to risks, issues, things that are going on in your project? Also, the project financial management. So we have a lot of clients that maybe aren't managing their budget from a project management standpoint and are really doing it retroactively based on invoices that come in. And maybe we're not even tracking the financial impact of the internal resources that are on projects. So that is a distant fourth. Anyone have any questions about that? Or it's a pretty well-known fact that resource management, capacity management is number one. Project prioritization, saying yes to the right projects at the right time is absolutely critical, and that is what we're going to be talking mostly about today. Again, project prioritization, although we'll be touching on resource management and visibility and reporting in that aspect as well. All right, so with that, I'm going to keep on going. So when we think about project prioritization, we're still using the data source of the PMO Outlook report of the 2021 edition. If you need a link to that report, I'm happy to share it. It is a public report. So what about project prioritization is the most challenging? So what we're going to be focusing on today specifically is aligning the portfolio projects with the corporate strategy. Do you have specific corporate goals, strategic goals, whether those might be sales or customer satisfaction, or like what are those strategic driving objectives for your organization? And do the projects that are in your portfolio represent those key strategies and key objectives, right? Also, accurately scoring the value of portfolio projects. There's a couple of different ways. We'll be talking a little bit about scoring today, but anywhere from tracking what you believe the expected outcome is to actually a more detailed and quantifiable return on investment, from a understanding of, again, scoring a project and how it is aligned with the different strategic objectives. Like there's a lot of different components. We're going to talk a little bit about prioritization drivers and scoring and things like that today, and some of the tools that might already be available to you that you can use here. We're not going to be talking too much about modeling scenarios to optimize your portfolio value. We find that we have those conversations more specific to tool sets that different clients have in-house. So we're not going to be talking too much about that today. We will be talking a lot about saying no to some projects in the portfolio, and not just saying no, but understanding who is saying no, when they are saying no, who needs to hear the no, when something is a not right now no versus a never no versus a duplicate no versus lots of other things. So it's not just about saying no, which is a great first step, but it's about communicating with the organization and the people that are putting those ideas in, back to the strategic alignment of those no's. And then tracking the value of portfolio projects delivered. Again, we spend a lot of time consulting on this when we talk about ROI, when we coach clients on that. We're not going to be getting into that too much today. So again, our focus for today, aligning your portfolio projects with your corporate strategy, with potential KPIs you have, or rocks or objectives. I mean, whatever your organization uses to track those value statements, value streams, how to score portfolio projects, how to do that with available tools that you have today, and then saying no to some projects and how we communicate that out to our teams and to the organization as a whole. Any questions about that? Anything that anyone wants to add to which element of project prioritization is the most challenging for your team? Does anyone have an example that they want to make sure that we're covering today? All right, well, with that, I'm going to go ahead and get right in. So at Echo, we're going to just use this to kind of frame our conversation today, right? So when we're thinking about projects, when we're thinking about prioritization, we're thinking about how to get the right information about the project to kind of understand if it moves forward. We have this kind of cheesy thing. It's called the Echo initiative or the Echo approach. It's going to be very similar to storm, norm, form, or form, storm, norm, something like that, right? So first we need to make sure that we're engaging the right stakeholders. The person that is asking for a project is not the only stakeholder that needs to be involved in prioritizing that project, right? So we can talk a little bit about the role of the sponsor today. We can talk about the role of the business case and the role of the people that are resource managers that are going to need to allocate resources to a project that might not be their highest priority. But we're going to talk a little bit about engaging the right stakeholders at the right point in time in the project intake process, right? An idea can come in. That might not be the time to take everyone's time to evaluate how much capacity it's going to be, but like, how do we identify when to bring the right stakeholders in to the process? Making sure that we're articulating the goals. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about business case development, ROI, and some other stuff like that. We'll be talking about the conflicts, right? So a lot of organizations have different goals for different parts of their organization. So like the financial team might have different goals than the sales, which might have different time than operations, right? How do we align behind the same strategic objectives so that we can all buy in on what projects are most important? And when people put their projects in, they understand that it's not happening now for a reason. It's not just no. I don't know if all of you have 4-year-olds, but I do. And no is no longer enough. So what information can we give to keep everyone bought in and marching to the same beat so that we really can maximize the ROI on our projects in alignment with our strategic goals? So there's going to be conflict. There's going to be conflicting priorities. One team is going to have their priorities and another team is going to have a different priorities. And oftentimes these projects require resources from multiple different teams, not just the teams that are the ones that are promoting the project, right? So I think a great example that we recently had, right, is, a team that was redoing invoicing and everything like that. And, it was accounting and they were pushing it, right? But they weren't the only ones that were stakeholders in that project, even though they might have been the primary users, right? The sales team, the customer success team, a bunch of other teams are involved. And so even though that project might not be in the highest priority for them, they still have to have resources. So how are we communicating that? There's a lot of conflict. There's different visions about how these projects can take. I'm sure you've understood that there's a project, there's a problem you're trying to solve with a project. And there's different visions about how that project could go, whether it's different software, whether that's a more manual versus an automated approach. There's different ways to solve problems, as we know. So when we just say this is a project that's moving forward, we still have a lot of flexibility in terms of what that project looks like, whether from it's a scope, schedule, budget, resourcing needs, incremental rollout, all that other good stuff. So we'll be talking a little bit about how to overcome some of the conflicts associated with prioritization when you have multiple teams involved. Harmonizing, how do we compromise? How do we negotiate? What are the trade-offs? How do we clarify what the shared vision is? The most classic example of this is you've got an approval to start a new project, and that's all well and good. But what does that mean for the existing projects that are already in flight, that already have approved timelines? When you have a new project that comes in that's super high priority, and sure, it's great that you've got an approval process and you've got an approval, assuming you have that, but let's go with that assumption, right? Well, that's great, but how does that impact all the other projects that are in flight? Are you really going to pause a project? Are you going to cancel a project? Are you going to, you know what I mean, take resources off that project and just kind of assume that everyone has more hours in the day now? So how do we harmonize that portfolio of projects without really causing a lot of angst for the team that's already been working on a project that's in flight? So this is something that is definitely difficult in the prioritization piece. And then how do we own? So we're not always going to agree with what the final decision is, what the impact to your project, if you're being pulled for another project that might be another team's higher priority, but how do we build alignment? How do we get buy-in? How do we have governance when those projects change? Project change is a fact. It's something that needs to be expected when we do portfolio management and project prioritization. That changes. The organization's priorities do change. And so we need to account for that. Okay, so again, a little bit cheesy, the ECHO method, but this is kind of how we're going to talk about it. So the first thing we're going to talk a little bit about is engaging stakeholders. So with that project intake process, we want to talk a little bit about the roles and responsibilities in the project intake process. And we're going to talk a little bit about best practices and considerations when you have, you know, a variety of different stakeholders involved in this process, okay? So from an engaged standpoint, in intake, we're going to talk about three main groups of roles. And again, some organizations have only, you know, a couple, some have 8 different roles, right? Because you might have a resource manager, a portfolio manager, a program manager, an executive leader, a budget component, all these different things. But for right now, we're going to talk a high level. We're going to talk about the 3 main components. We're going to talk about the requesters, so people that are putting in a request for a new project or initiative in the organization, people that are reviewing and hopefully approving or saying no, as we'll talk a little bit about later. And then the actual doers, right? The doers, the resources that will be assigned to this project or maybe unassigned from a different project to get reassigned. So we need to take in their as well. So again, high level, the requesters, who's asking for this new work and this new project outcome, who's reviewing it, who are the, you know, the stage gates and the approvers, and then who are the people that are actually going to get assigned. Okay, so again, requester, reviewer, doer, and we're going to talk a little bit about the different roles. So the requester, let me tell you what my requesters are usually like. They wanted it yesterday. And their request is definitely the most important request because obviously they needed it yesterday. Now, typically what they are telling you is what the solution is going to look like, right? Like I need this tool, right? But they're not actually usually articulating what the underlying problem is. So they're saying, hey, I need this, I need that, this is the project, and oftentimes they struggle with that. What was the underlying problem? Because that might give us some flexibility in terms of what the solution would look like. And guess what? They don't want all the process. They want it to be quick and easy, right? Like this is straightforward. We already know, we've done the prep work. We just need to, get this out. Like this doesn't necessarily need to go through the process, right? And guess what? I want to know when it's going to be done. Like, why aren't you giving me the date today about when this is? I just submitted it. So does anyone have any requesters that, are like this? Does anyone struggle with requesters that, wanted it done yesterday? No, well, I'm glad that you don't, but this is a very typical role. So we want to make sure that we are maturing our requesters, that we are bringing in our sponsors and people that have a more broader perspective, but we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So next we're talking about the reviewers. Guess what? The reviewers are often resource managers and they have limited resources and change is really hard. And guess what? They really prefer to focus on their projects that are already in flight before they assign new projects out, because they want to get done their current ones. They want to wrap up. They want to be on time. They don't really want to change it. They want to get this done. And what they're really looking to do is say, okay, that project can fit in, 3 to 6 months from now, even if that project is super high priority. And they're pretty frustrated, if someone comes in and says, no, this trumps everything. And, there might be a little bit of, concern about leadership not really understanding what they're doing, and they don't really understand resourcing. And these reviewers are people that really want to be strategic. Like they understand this concept of there's lots of different things going on and we need to pick the highest priority ones, but they're so bogged down in day-to-day escalations and firefighting that they often feel like they don't have the capacity to actually be strategic in their projects, and they just have to go from, jump from fire to fire. And they are weighed down because they're constantly being asked about what the status is and why the data isn't up to date. Most likely they're ones that are getting called into question because they have 4 or 5 different systems that they have to update, and like, where was that? Like, what is the status? Does anyone, identify at all with this reviewer role? Okay. All right, and the last one is the doer, right? And basically they're in a spot where they have multiple different projects ongoing and they want to know what the priority is. And it's not just the project priority. They get frustrated because they're like, this project is really, really high priority. Well, that's all well and good, but like, I need to know right now at a task level if I'm working on this task or if I'm working on this task, and what the implication is if I can't get this task done for this project, versus another one. And they're constantly making judgment calls, and they are trying to figure out how to ask the right questions because they don't want to be a no person. They want to be a team player, but they have 10 different priorities and it's changing. And this is especially true of project doers that are not just a full-time project management, like a project resource, right? Like they might also have operational jobs and they're being tasked with this project as a subject matter expert, right? So they have all these different priorities, and sometimes they're just so bogged down in like task level information that they're not really sure like that they're working on the highest priority items. This is especially true if maybe they're tasked on a project that isn't a project that their team is sponsoring, right? So like if you're working on a project that's in your department, the teams and the end users that are being impacted by this, it's typically easier to, be aligned and understand and, work that little bit extra. But when you're a subject matter expert on a project that maybe isn't for your specific team or it's a little bit further out, it can be really difficult to understand the value that this project is bringing, and it can be a lot easier to get frustrated. And oh, by the way, they're a doer, so the requirements are constantly changing, along with the schedule and all the other good things, right? So change management is hard. It's awesome, but it's also hard. So doers oftentimes get whiplash, especially when something that they've been working on gets paused for another project, which they may or may not be associated with. Anyone identify with a doer? All right, I'm assuming someone else is managing chat, so I'm going to just keep talking until um, someone interrupts me. So we're talking about our intake roles, right? And we're thinking about the high level intake process, right? So we've got the requester. Maybe there's an intake form. I don't know how exactly you collect your new projects. Maybe there's a form that says, oh, hey, fill this form out for a new project on your list. Most of the time in organizations, we find it's like it's in a meeting, it's an idea that comes out of something. Maybe it's a project that had additional scope and needs to get broken out into a different project. Maybe it's coming from some sort of like tech roadmap or strategic roadmap annually or budgeting. There's a lot of different ways projects come in, but there's some sort of place, like the number one step in project prioritization is to have a project list and to have this concept of the project list and where they are in the phases, right? So is this just an idea? Has this been reviewed at all? Where in the project phase it is? And these are project phases before the actual project actually happens and the project phases of delivery. I'm talking about pretty much the same concept as a lead generation process or sales development. It's like, here's an idea. How does the idea get to a point where you're approving it or funding it or getting to the point of planning and resourcing and all that other good stuff? Because there's different information you need at different points. So again, what is the intake process, right? once they've submitted that this project, maybe they put a lot of time in and put together a business case or something like that. They want to then know what the status is. When is it going to be reviewed? When is someone going to give me a response on this? Who's the next person in this process? So it's really important that we have the ability as a requester, especially if you're asking them to provide information or put in work and homework before then, is able to see the view the status. Then the reviewer, the same people don't need to review all different types of projects, right? So maybe the project is only impacting a single department or organization, so it can just go to that senior leader there or to a manager and a team. Or maybe it's a project that's going to impact the entire organization, in which case there's multiple different people that need to be involved in the review process. Who is the initial reviewer to make sure that everything is there and what's required before you actually present a business case out to a larger group? How do we know we have the right information? And then the doers, in terms of, do they need to see kind of what is coming down the pike to them and or scheduling that they might be resourced on this upcoming project so that they have some visibility? Okay. So just really quick on intake form, if you don't have an intake form now, it can be something as easy as a Google sheet or an Excel spreadsheet. But the first step is to have a list of all the different projects, right? If you're using SharePoint, if you're using a project management tool, it's like you can have multiple different lists in terms of like marketing has one list of projects and sales has a different list and IT usually has a different list, HR. That's fine, but how do you see all of them together, all of the different project initiatives that are going through your organization? It's really critical. So what is the standard information you need? I do recommend that you use, a form or a sheet with required information. One of the concepts we've been talking a lot about already is this progressive elaboration. So we understand that when something first comes in, it's really important to minimize what I call the barriers to entry, right? We want to know about all these different ideas that people have, potential projects. And what sometimes happens in a PMO is there's such there's too high of an amount of information that's needed before they can submit a project, right? So if I have to spend 8 hours filling out this business case form and I don't have all this information and I've never done an ROI calculation, or I need to access to other resources not on my team in order to even get this information, then you end up not getting it listed until much later in the game. So how do we create a process in which we can have the bare minimum information before we have an initial review and then ask for additional information? And how do we make sure that the people that we're asking the information are the people that are closest to it? So just because someone has an idea or a project idea and they want to push it forward doesn't mean that they're the ones that can provide the best visibility in terms of what that project it'll take to actually execute that project, or the ROI that that project would have, or even who will be impacted by that project scope. So there's a difference between someone that is the person that's initially even like a sponsor or a VP or even a C-suite person, right? Saying, hey, I want to do this project, and actually having enough information so that their group of their peers and the approval has enough information to be able to make an educated decision about what that would be. Does that make sense to everyone? So it's really important that we think about a process that includes progressive elaboration. So continuously improving the plan and the information that you need. So minimum barriers to entry to get initial information and visibility into the projects and ideas that people have. And then progressively more information as it goes further along in the process until it is either told, nope, it's a no, it's a backlog, maybe in the future, or it's a yes, in which case more information is needed. Okay, so an incremental process, progressive elaboration, more accurate information as more information becomes available, right? Making sure that we're updating those estimates, both from a duration standpoint and a budget standpoint and scoping and all those other things, making sure that we're updating it as we go, as more information becomes available. So when we say view status, I want to make sure, so I'm going fast here, right? So progressive elaboration, we need more information as we go. So the initial intake might be pretty basic, but then more information is needed before it goes into an approval process. When we talk about viewing status from a requester standpoint, requesters are oftentimes your managers, their C-suite, they're people that have said this idea, but they haven't really necessarily like dug in on it, but they want to make sure that you're not just dropping it somewhere. Like maybe you have all these other projects that are in flight, but someone some point is going to ask you what the status of this project is. And if you have literally just not done anything with it, you can get in a little bit of trouble here, right? So it's important that we understand we capture things even when they're in their infancy and start providing status on them. And what I like to say is that you want to be able to provide status both from a push and pull approach, right? So what typically happens is someone mentions an idea in a meeting or something like that. Maybe it's your manager, your manager's manager, or a C-suite person. And then, they ask a month later being like, hey, what's the status of this? As if they think something somehow has magically started happening on this, even though they haven't heard anything about it. So it's really important to have visibility on this is where it is. It hasn't gone anywhere because it doesn't have a business case, or, hey, it doesn't have a whatever this is. But we want to be able to push information to them. So like push notifications, like letting them know. And we also want them to be able to see the information of the status in the context of other requests that they have made and or other work that's ongoing in the organization. Does that make sense? So we want to be able to have push, more of a notification saying, hey, yeah, after your idea, I put it on the list. Like, here you go. You're listed as a sponsor, buddy. And then also pull being like, they can see it. So if they want to know what the status of it is, they're not just seeing the status of their item, but they're also seeing like, oh, and guess what? You're in line with 40 other ideas. So does that make sense to everyone? So push and pull approach for status visibility of a project. When you think about like a project is coming in an approval and like a multi-scenario, a multi-stakeholder scenario, right? We want to make sure that we understand what that review workflow looks like, both from a review and an approval. So who needs to see the information and say that there is enough information in order for a decision to be made, and who actually needs to be able to sign off? Signing off and like doing that via email, doing that via follow-up can be a really time-intensive thing. And especially when you have to get multiple different stakeholders involved. So do you have an approval workflow? And again, we implement lots of task management systems. So we have a lot of traction with Smartsheet and Monday, and we definitely are a Microsoft shop and Power Automate and all those other good things, right? But what does that approval workflow look like? How do they mark it as approved? What if they approve it with exceptions or with edits? And if those edits need to go back to see other people because it might impact their opinion as well. What if they reject it? Like, what if they reject the project? What does that rejection actually mean? And are there different flows for rejection in your organization? So if you have this great project, you want to do this, and the manager's manager says, you know what, it's not happening this year, right? Does that get communicated back proactively to the person that requested it and to the team that's spot in on that? And how are you articulating it? It's not a no. Oftentimes it'll just get put to backlog and no one ever really says no, and or they never communicate the no. But being proud of saying no is something that we all need to get on board with, right? So projects, one of the CIOs of a very large organization that we work with came in, and one of the first questions he asked, which I love him. He's like, what percentage of projects do we deny? And they're like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, at the approval process, what number of projects do you deny? And they're like 1% or 5%. I mean, just if they need to, like, no, we should not be approving 100% of our projects or 90% of our projects. I'm going to make up a statistic. I'm telling you, I'm making it up right now. But if you are saying yes to more than 50% of your projects, you probably have something broken in your workflow, right? You're probably not capturing information about projects early enough in the process and providing too much information on them before you go, and or you're approving too many projects, or you're approving something and then without a real plan to how to get it there. So it's not really an actual approval. So depending on how you want to use the language, approval versus, go ahead to get started, but like keep it on pause. It's really important that your organization has an understanding of what an approval means, what the phases are, like approval, funding, actually planning for when it can start, understanding which stakeholders need to be involved and what information is needed. And critical is celebrating no's. Celebrating no's. That is a major sign of a mature PMO, is the ability to say no to projects, the ability to say not right now, and not just saying no, but providing the reason in a confident way. We are not focusing on this because we are focusing on this, and this is aligned with the strategic goals of our organization. All right. We should be celebrating no's, not because you don't have capacity, not because you don't have enough resources and things like that, because we are confident that the projects that we are promoting and saying yes to are the projects that are going to bring the most return on investment to our project portfolio, to our organization, to the strategic objectives of our company. Sorry, a little bit soapboxy, guys. You know I get passionate about this subject. Prioritization is like my jam. All right, so the reviewer. We talked a little bit about this before, but the reviewer and the assignment process. So is review going to be done by all of the directors if it's like a marketing project, or maybe we just need the marketing director if it's only impacting the marketing resources? And again, there's a lot of assumptions I'm making here right now. The assumption I'm making most frequently is that you have a single project list and that all your projects are going through the same approval process. I oftentimes with clients try to divvy up what I call, resources that are all from the same team, which I oftentimes call like department initiatives versus a project. And oftentimes when I'm referring to a project, I'm referring to a cross-functional project. So multiple different teams of resources are involved. That might not work for your organization, right? This is a high-level presentation, so obviously I'm not speaking to your specific organization, but there's a different approval process for someone that owns all of the resources that are needed for the project, right? That includes budget approval as well as the actual people that need to be on the project, versus a project that impacts multiple different teams. Potentially the sponsor isn't the actual manager of the project, right? So it's really important that you separate those out in some way, whether it's a different project type, but it's definitely a different workflow. We do not want to send every single project. Another example that I use all the time, I talk about the apple seed versus the apple versus the fruit basket, right? So I do not want approval from senior leadership on a task level information that's a project that's going to be less than a week or something like that, right? So do not want the seeds to show up along the apple trees or the apple, not the apples, the fruit basket. Sorry, I'm losing my own, right? I don't, for an apple, and it's only an apple, maybe that's the marketing team's project. And like, I don't want the CFO necessarily to have to look and see the marketing project. I already have a designated budget. I already have approval on something like from a budgeting standpoint. I don't want to have to show everyone. I don't want that to be showing up there and distracting from what I actually need them to weigh in on. So there needs to be a different process for what I call a fruit basket, right? That cross-functional piece that actually has multiple different pieces in play. So understanding who needs to review based on the different project type, the different levels. Oftentimes organizations have this based on, a budget level, because that is lined up with in terms of who is able to approve different budget expenditures. But anyways, whatever those different project categorizations are. Okay. And then if it is reviewed by someone, what next? Is there an acknowledgement of the review? Is there a document that they need to review? Is there information that they need to provide? So it's not just a checkbox, oh yeah, I looked at this, but is there specific information that you need from that reviewer? Oftentimes they are a subject matter expert in and of themselves, right? And then also, if there are questions, if there are clarifications, if there is a review or an approval with exceptions, how are you tracking those? How are you following up on those? And then also an SLA expectation for review turnaround. I know that your requester, everything needed to be done yesterday and everything is the highest priority. But how do you actually prioritize these new inbound requests alongside all of your active projects and work that you're already doing? There should be expectations associated with when people are going to review different projects, and there needs to be some sort of process for like expediting those requests. And if you're still in person, if that's, dropping it off in their desk in printed format, that works if it's a chat or something like that. But ideally, there is a process for bringing the right people in and setting expectations about when you need their review so that you can get on the docket for whatever next meeting or milestone there is. Okay. Oftentimes before a project is, even if the project is already approved, just because a project is approved in a lot of organizations doesn't actually mean that it has resources or it has a start date, right? Sometimes, the rubber stamp of being like, oh, this team of people, this this leadership group, right? They've reviewed this project and said, yes, go ahead with this project. And that's great. You've got the rubber stamp. Go you. But do you actually have a plan for how to execute that project? Does that schedule that was proposed actually work? Do you have the right resources? There's oftentimes an additional component of this associated with resourcing capacity. Now, remember, if we go back to our what is the biggest challenge you face today with managing your project portfolio, the number one issue is resource management. So even if you go through the entire intake process, let's say all the information was there, all the right people reviewed it, and you get approval. Yay, you have prioritized the project and you feel good about going forward. But now you need to resource it. And as we know, right, resources are limited. And sometimes, even if you have resources available, you might not have the best resource or the optimal resource or the resource that you specifically want on this initiative. Because that person might have, I don't know, a full-time operational job, or they might be on another project that is, oh my gosh, just going into testing, it'll just be a couple more weeks. And we've all heard that before. So anyways, the actual resource management side of things and assigning the right people and being able to commit to a schedule and baseline a schedule is oftentimes difficult. And if you just get the approval and your process is just basically like, yeah, the right people have seen it, the right people have reviewed it, they've approved it, but there is no concept of capacity and when things can start and when that schedule is, there is another approval that still needs to happen. And maybe you have a stage gate process and that comes in after the initial plan and everything like that. But be aware, even before you get to that point of that whole resourcing plan, you still need to have those kind of initial resources to flesh it out to that next level. So this can be really hard. So there's a couple of different ways we've seen this successful with different clients of different sizes, right? We oftentimes do a level of effort. And we assign kind of goals for effort in the estimation process as well as for the actual project. And oftentimes we talk about diminishing returns, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. But the idea is that there's only so much time you want to spend in estimating because obviously new information comes in throughout the whole thing, right? And then again, not just prioritization and approval, but how do we actually say when something can start in alignment of prioritizing, not just saying this project is important or not, but saying this project is important in comparison to projects that are already in flight. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna skip over here, notification of assignment, all those other good things. So approval workflow versus requester workflow. We're gonna be talking a little bit about change requirements and things like that. So we went through the high level intake process. So now let's talk about conflicting priorities, because throughout this process, not everyone is going to agree on what is the highest priority. I know this is shocking to you and you've never run into a situation where you have different stakeholders thinking different things are higher priority, but let's go with the assumption that you've run into that before. And you're being asked, like, if I'm a reviewer, who do I have for project X? Project X just came in and now it needs a team. But which is more important, this project or the project that they're already on? But that doesn't work for my team. So we're saying, okay, great, like you want this resource, but I already have my team on this other thing. That's the higher priority. And then oftentimes, sometimes people will get brought in at the end. So if they weren't reviewed in the beginning, they're in a situation where they actually are being told when we're already in testing or, kind of trying to roll things out. So that person's really only alternative is to say no go, I don't have a resource, and come across as like a no go person, right? And then when they go live anyways, I know no one's ever had a situation like that, go live, or they continue to move forward even without the buy-in of that team. It tends to fail or not be adopted. And then there's an I told you so, and you've got a disgruntled employee. And as we know right now, it is a okay environment to be a disgruntled employee and move on. And then you're losing that entire skill set. So we got to be careful to bring people along as we go, right? We need to make sure that they do have capacity, that they understand why a project is important relative to other things that they're working on. We need to make sure that they're involved in components. So here, what we're talking about is like what resources feel like when new projects approved, things got moved around, everything, right? There's frustration, there's burnout, it's over budget, it's behind schedule, there's low return on investment on the projects because we're not getting what we thought out of the projects because we didn't start to measure at the beginning. And again, what oftentimes happens, two of my favorite concepts, you can tell that I'm an economics major, right, are diminishing returns, right? So when I talk about estimation, diminishing returns is something I always talk to my teams about, which is it can be really useful to have something. So even if you don't know all the information, having an estimate, having a range, having an idea is really important. And this is the most productive, is to have something written down, even if you're not super confident. You can definitely put a confidence threshold or ratio in there if you need to make yourself feel better. I've definitely worked with development teams and people that do not want to estimate because they don't have enough information yet. I get that. It's hard. You don't have enough information, but having some level of effort, some idea is really important. But spending 40 hours estimating something that may or may not get approved isn't usually a high value point of your time, right? So we do need to be aware of making sure we have some information, not too much information, and wasting key resources time. Same thing as analysis paralysis, right? So the group is overanalyzing, overthinking, spending too much time in the beginning, and really the decision making becomes paralyzed. This is critical to think about in portfolio management, because when you start looking at a list of 700 projects, like one of my clients, it's pretty much impossible to even put those 700 projects in line and say, ooh, this is number 1 out of the 700, right? That's a waste of time. But oftentimes what your teams are asking you for is not a project versus project. They're looking at specific tasks in a specific way in a specific week and how those are impacted by the changes. So again, that's what we're talking about today, is that project prioritization, project intake process, understanding that project prioritization is not just something that happens when a new project idea comes in. Project prioritization is something that is happening all the time as all your different projects are in play. And we should not only be looking at projects in comparison to other idea projects, but we need to be looking at projects that are actually in scope. So to do some of those things, what we're going to do is we're going to start drilling down into what we're called prioritization drivers. A prioritization driver is it's often what I like to do is I like to align them to the strategic goals of the organization. So these are like targeted outcomes or key objectives that are aligned with your goals. And those can be a couple different things, right? So KPIs, strategic goals, OKRs, like whatever your organization uses for measuring what the expectation is for a given department or something like that. So some examples of prioritization drivers. And again, if you've been at any of my other workshops, definitely SMART goals, measurable targets, things like that. This is just giving you ideas of things that different companies are working on from a strategic objective standpoint, right? So oftentimes there's something associated with sales or revenue and numbers, profitability. There's oftentimes cost reduction components and profitability. There's brand positioning, and there's oftentimes legal and compliance things. You might have an end of life for a software, or you might have a new law or legal component that's coming into play this year. And those are things that have to get prioritized along with all the other projects. Quality, capacity, customer satisfaction, there's all sorts of these different things. Now, ideally, it's not just going to be a very broad theme like I've given here, but instead it's going to be a more targeted, like measurable component. But let's just kind of use these high level ones for today. Oopsies. I clicked on something I didn't mean to click on, guys. Sorry, give me 1 second to get back to where I was. All right. No, I'm still clicking on something I don't mean to click on. All right, how do I advance? There we go. So how well aligned are your projects to strategic business priorities? Melissa, if you want to go ahead and add that into the chat, people are welcome to do that. We can share that at the end. Again, we're just going to show what the PMO Outlook report is for 2021 edition. This is a great report if you guys are looking for it. Happy to send this out. So projects, teams that have perfectly aligned projects, all their projects are perfectly aligned with their strategic goals. As you will see, there is no green here, right? Very well aligned. Only 25%, about a quarter of people think that their projects are well aligned with the strategic goals of their organization. somewhat aligned, over 50%, not aligned at all, right? Not very aligned, or not aligned at all, right? So 75% of people don't really see a strong alignment between the projects that they're working on, right, and the actual strategic goals and objectives of the organization. Now, different organizations we work with have different levels of maturity in terms of how visible the strategic goals are. Some organizations have those very visible, they have them measurable, you can see where they are. Other people, it's just like very broad themes, or they're pivoting very rapidly and they're not necessarily clear in terms of leadership. So there is always that leadership component available in terms of like how noticeable they are. But it is really important that we're talking about projects and we're prioritizing. We're saying, oh, this is high priority versus not high priority. Oftentimes you're talking about high priority or not priority in terms of like a specific department or organization. But what are the actual strategic goals of the organization? Not just ROI in terms of dollars, but ROI in terms of where your company is going. So anyways, sorry, again, a little bit preachy there, but the alignment of projects and clear alignment and communication of what the value of the project is to your organization, not just dollars and cents. Although dollars and cents is better than nothing. So again, trajectory here, we mature as we go. So harmonizing, and this is where I was kind of going there, which is communication methods, which is how are we communicating the value of our portfolio, the value of our PMO. We won't go too deep into that because I'm just trying to stay mostly on prioritization and intake, but the value of a PMO is something that, again, near and dear to my heart, but also the value of saying no and articulating the why is such a huge opportunity for PMOs and for organizations to say no because of this, and being able to generate buy-in from there. And then balancing of the portfolios, both from a resourcing standpoint as well as a strategic objective. So if that's great, like if they're all sales oriented, our team actually has this right now, right? So we have goals and we manage them quarterly. But most of our goals right now, I believe, are actually sales and marketing, and we have a huge backlog of work. So what we should be doing is, some of our goals that we're working on should be more in the operational space because we're growing very rapidly and we want to streamline some of our processes, right? Sometimes we have a portfolio of projects that are really heavy on either a specific type of resource that are needed, or they're all starting at the same time, or maybe they're really aligned with one goal of the organization, but the organizational goals need to be more dispersed and we need to make progress along multiple different areas. So balancing the portfolio. And then I just want to show you a really quick prioritization matrix. If you haven't used this before, a lot of organizations have. You can do this in a sheet or Google Sheet or Excel. And we have a product add-in we're kind of working on as well for this. So this is a little bit broad, but really quick communication methods. We talk about people that are the loudest in the room tend to get their projects approved more, right? Or the people that are loudest in the room typically get the get more visibility. But then the quieter people, right, maybe aren't getting as many representation data points. So some of the communication methods to kind of drive towards more equitable or quantifiable results is to try to do surveys and anonymous voting or a prioritization matrix where everyone gets one vote. So that can be really useful from a review standpoint. It can be really useful if you are voting on priorities, making sure everyone has one vote, because if you're doing it solely via a meeting, oftentimes those more vocal people are the ones that are going to get their representation. Oftentimes this is also the case if you have one team that's much bigger than another team, that team that's bigger somehow gets a greater priority in their vote, and that can really lead to some not ideal movement for the organization as a whole for projects. Okay, so scenario, your house is on fire. This is one of my examples I use with risk management. But basically your house is on fire, and guess what? Everything is super important to get out of your house that is on fire. But I think that if you were forced to, you could probably narrow things down, right? So here we go. We're just looking at a quick Eisenhower method. This is, it's one of the most basic ones, right? But there's things that are urgent and important. So there's projects that are urgent and important. There's projects that are really important but not urgent. Oftentimes these projects get forgotten. And then things that are urgent but not important. Oftentimes those things are, get more visibility. And then the not important, not urgent. We need to be confident in saying no, not just leaving it on the backlog or not saying, let's look at it again. Like if something's a no, it's a no. We're not getting the couch out of the burning building. Like just, it's not happening. So let's say no. Okay, and then there's other ways as well. So you might have heard of the RICE method. So reach, impact, confidence divided by effort. And then, so again, there's different calculations we can show you associated with that. When we think of project portfolio selection, there's a lot of different tools and graphics that can be done for this, but oftentimes, you're looking at expensiveness. And again, expense doesn't only mean like dollars. For a company that is cash poor, it's different, right? But for organizations that maybe are resource poor, expense means something different to them. But whatever is expensive, whatever is your most in-demand resource at the time, you want to take that into account. And then also a balance of your portfolio of short-term versus long-term growth. I'm reading this awesome book called The Long Game by Dory Clark. And again, especially Americans, but in general, businesses are really short-term. Like, what does the next quarter look like? What does the next 6 months look like? Versus these projects that are going to really keep you growing and give you an edge longer term. And we need to be having a combination of both short-term and long-term growth objectives as we look at balancing our portfolio. And then you can use things like size or color to distinguish other information, such as project type or project, project duration or something like that, right? So again, using a basic matrix and using all the different variables you have. So in this case, I just picked expense, short-term, long-term ROI, right? And then I haven't called it out, but I can use color. For example, marketing would be orange and IT would be dark blue and green would be sales or something like that, right? And then I can use a relative size associated with the budget. So I can use up to 4 different distinguishing factors to kind of get a visualization of the different projects in play. Again, sorry. Oopsies. Here we go, guys. So back here, so ability to weight drivers based on short-term and long-term needs, the importance of opportunity costs. So because you're working on this project, you're not working on a different project, that's important to call out. Ignoring sunk costs. So this is something that's really hard. We've already spent money on this project, right? We've already spent money. And so we do not want to, we do not want to not finish this project because we started. But if there's a higher project of higher priority, if there are other things that could add more value, we need to be willing to get rid of the concept that, we've already spent money on it and just look at the overall strategic goals at this given moment. And then the ecosystem view, opt-in versus opt-out for stakeholders. This is what I like to talk about, which is oftentimes we only send things for review for people that we think will be interested in the project or we think will be impacted. It can be really valuable for an organization to actually send it out all projects and say, does this impact your team? And have them actually be the ones that need to say it does or doesn't. Okay, I just got my 5-minute warning and we know I like to talk. Prioritization matrix method. So this is just a couple of examples. This is just an Excel spreadsheet. It's very basic. You have your projects and initiatives. You have your different drivers up here. You'll notice that we've added this component of weight. So you're voting on 1 through 5, and then you can change the weight. So you can see the average versus the weighted and how that might change which projects are the highest priority. So again, you're calling it out here versus the weighted components to see how the weight's different here. And so the ones that you pick are different. We often use this as well, kind of using it without the numbers, because sometimes numbers can intimidate people in terms of how they vote. So using words instead, so poor, great, good, okay, and doing some of the things like that. I'll just give a really quick overview. We're doing a project prioritization. This is just a sneak peek of one of our products add-ons called Streamline. And it's the concept of being able to compare projects and rate them and all that other good stuff via an easy to use app. And then really quick, because we said we were going to say no, communicate, communicate to communicate, we need to articulate the priorities of the teams across multiple levels, the priority of the organization, the priorities of your team, and the individual priorities are also important. And as your manager, as a manager, if you have teams members under you, understanding that maybe they want experience in a specific type of project or something like that, and acknowledging those. Empowering team, planning time for prioritization. This is something that should be part of your schedule. Making sure that we are mapping things back to the big picture, making sure that we are spending time when projects are canceled midstream, because that is a normal scenario in most cases. We do not just continue on with projects, even if they're not the highest priority. We need to make sure that we have a grieving process, acknowledging the value of work done to date, allow for grief, and highlighting the dependencies and synergies of the work done to date with what's going to be happening. So anyways, yes, I rushed the last little bit, but that was an overview of some project intake and prioritization tips and tricks that we use with some of our clients. Oftentimes we're doing it in the terms of implementing a project management office process flow and or tool set associated with some of these reviews and approvals and automating some of those processes. We do, if you enjoy this event, we do have some upcoming events available. These are all free webinars. We give these out to our community. Our values are learn, share, grow, care. As we learn new things, we love to share them. And so we're going to be sharing about lean project management. We're going to be talking a little bit about, this is Smartsheet specific, but we're going to be talking about metrics and metrics widgets on dashboards. We'll be talking about strategies for overcoming project management challenges. And we will also be talking about, oh, it looks like another Smartsheet one for conditional formatting and automations in Smartsheet. So if you're interested, don't hesitate to contact us. Our information will be here and we will send that out later today.